At 11:23 p.m. on August 14, 1942, Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova felt the first tracer round punch through the canvas wing of her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane. The round didn't explode. It simply tore a hole and continued past. Then came the second round, and the third. The fourth tracer, fired from a German anti-aircraft position 800 meters below, struck the aircraft's fuel tank. Fuel sprayed into the open cockpit. Popova felt liquid splash across her face, her flight suit, her hands on the control stick. The smell of aviation gasoline filled her nostrils. Behind her, in the navigator's cockpit, Katya Ryabova screamed, "We're hit! Fuel everywhere!" Popova didn't need confirmation. She could see fuel streaming from the tank, creating a visible vapor trail in the moonlight. Any spark, from engine exhaust, from friction, from another tracer round, would ignite the fuel. The Po-2 was made of plywood covered with fabric, treated with highly flammable dope. When these aircraft caught fire, they burned completely in 15-20 seconds. Pilots called it riding the torch. Once the fire started, you had perhaps 10 seconds before the flames consumed you, and Popova had no parachute. The Po-2 couldn't carry the extra weight. If the aircraft caught fire, she had two options: burn to death in the cockpit or jump to her death from 2,500 feet. Both options ended the same way. She checked her instruments by moonlight. Altitude, 2,500 feet. Airspeed, 85 mph. Engine, running normally, still producing power. No fire yet, but the fuel vapor was building. One spark and the entire aircraft would become an inferno. Ryabova's voice came through the speaking tube. The Po-2 had no radio, just a simple tube connecting the two cockpits. "Nadia, we need to land, now, before it ignites." Popova scanned the ground below. They were over German-held territory, 5 miles from the front lines, no friendly airfields within gliding range. If she shut down the engine to eliminate the spark risk, they'd glide maybe 2 miles and crash in German territory. Capture, interrogation, execution, not acceptable. Then Popova had an idea. It was insane. It violated every principle of flight safety she'd ever learned. But it might work. Fire needs 3 things: fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. They had fuel, gallons of it spraying through the cockpit. They had oxygen, plenty in the open cockpit. If a spark created an ignition source, the fire would start and they'd die. But what if she could eliminate the oxygen? What if she could blow out the fuel vapor before it ignited? The only way to do that was to increase airspeed dramatically and create enough wind blast to disperse the vapor. But the Po-2's maximum speed was 94 mph in level flight. To reach the 120-150 mph needed to create sufficient wind force, she'd have to dive, straight down, at 2,500 feet altitude, with fuel-soaked controls, in an aircraft that might ignite at any moment. It was suicidal, but staying at 2,500 feet waiting for the inevitable spark was also suicidal. At least diving gave her a chance. "Katya!" Popova shouted through the speaking tube. "Hold on! I'm diving!" Before Ryabova could respond, Popova pushed the control stick forward. The Po-2's nose dropped. The aircraft transitioned from level flight to a 45-degree dive, then steeper, 60 degrees, 70 degrees, approaching vertical. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 2,500 feet, 2,200 feet, 2,000 feet. Airspeed increased, 95 mph per 100 mph, 110 mph. The wind began screaming through the open cockpit. At 120 mph, the wind blast became violent. Popova's goggles were ripped from her face. Fuel spray that had been coating the cockpit was now being blown away by the 120 mph wind. She held the dive. 1,800 feet, 1,600 feet, 1,400 feet. Airspeed, 125 mph. The Po-2 was never designed for this. The wooden frame creaked. The fabric covering rippled and tore in places. But the wind blast was working. The fuel vapor was dispersing. The thick smell of gasoline in the cockpit was fading. At 1,200 feet altitude, Popova began the pullout. She eased back on the control stick. The The Po-2 responded sluggishly. The fuel-soaked controls were stiff. She pulled harder. The aircraft's nose came up. 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. At 800 feet altitude, the Po-2 leveled off. Popova checked her fuel gauge. The tank was still leaking, but the spray had stopped. The dive had blown out the vapor, and apparently the wind pressure had partially sealed the leak. The aircraft was still flyable. Ryabova's voice came through the tube. "Nadia, what did you just do?" Popova's hands were shaking on the control stick. "I blew out the fire before it started. Can a pilot save her aircraft by doing the one thing flight training says will kill you? Can a 20-year-old woman flying a wooden training plane dive at 125 mph to disperse fuel vapor while German guns shoot at her? Please like this video to see how this story continues. Subscribe for more impossible decisions that saved lives, and let's go back to December 1921, when a girl was born in a Ukrainian coal mining town who would become one of history's most accomplished combat pilots. Nadezhda Vasilyevna Popova was born on December 17, 1921, in Shabanovka, a small town in the Donetsk coal mining region of Ukraine. Her father worked for the railway. The family was poor, but stable. Young Nadia grew up in the 1920s and 1930s during the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization. The Donetsk region was transforming from agricultural villages into industrial centers. Coal mines, steel mills, railway yards, the landscape was changing. And with industrialization came new opportunities. One of those opportunities was aviation. The Soviet Union in the 1930s was obsessed with aviation. Building a modern air force was a national priority. Flying clubs opened in every major city, offering flight training to civilians. The goal was creating a population of trained pilots who could be mobilized in wartime. Nadezhda Popova joined her local flying club at age 15 in 1936. She'd been looking for something exciting to do. Music and dance were fine, but flying was extraordinary. Her instructors noted that she was a natural pilot, smooth control inputs, good spatial awareness, calm under pressure. By age 17, she'd earned her pilot's license and was qualified to fly the U-2 biplane, which would later be redesignated the Po-2. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Popova was 19 years old. Her brother was killed in the first weeks of the invasion when German forces overran their hometown. Her family home was commandeered by German officers. Everything she'd known was destroyed. Popova's response was immediate. She would fight. She volunteered for military service within days of the invasion. The problem was that the Soviet Air Force, like every other Air Force in 1941, didn't accept women as combat pilots. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, mechanics, support roles, but not combat. Popova refused to accept this. She contacted every aviation unit she could find, requesting combat assignment. All rejected her. Then, in October 1941, Popova heard about Major Marina Raskova's call for female pilots. Raskova, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, had convinced Stalin to authorize 3 all-female aviation regiments. One would fly fighters, one would fly dive bombers, and one, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would fly Po-2 biplanes on night harassment missions. Popova applied immediately. She was accepted based on her flying club experience and her motivation. In November 1941, she traveled to Engels Military Aviation School near Saratov for training. The training was intense. Popova and 200 other women learned navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, bombing techniques, and night flying. They trained from November 1941 through May 1942, 6 months compressed from the normal 18-month program for men. The instructors sorted recruits by skill level. The best pilots went to the 586th Fighter Regiment with modern Yak-1 fighters. Middle-tier pilots went to the 587th Bomber Regiment with PE-2 dive bombers. The least experienced pilots, including Popova, were assigned to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment with obsolete Po-2 training aircraft. Popova felt humiliated. She'd wanted to fly fighters. Instead, she was assigned to fly crop dusters. The Polikarpov Po-2 that the 588th would fly was a 1928 design. The aircraft was a biplane constructed from wood, plywood, and fabric. Maximum speed, 94 mph. Service ceiling, 9,800 feet. Range, 400 miles. Bomb load, 2 100-kilogram, 220-pound bombs, one under each wing. That was it. No armor, no defensive weapons initially, no radio, no parachutes because the aircraft couldn't carry the extra weight, open cockpits with no heating. If you were hit by anti-aircraft fire, you burned. If you were caught by searchlights, you were targeted by every gun in the area. If you crashed, you died. The Po-2 was essentially a death trap, but Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the 588th's commander, saw potential. The Po-2 was slow, but slow meant maneuverable. It was made of wood and fabric, but that meant radar couldn't detect it reliably. It had minimal bomb load, but that meant pilots could fly multiple missions per night. Bershanskaya told her pilots, "We've been given this aircraft because the Air Force doesn't believe women can fly real bombers. We'll prove them wrong." The 588th deployed to the front lines in May 1942. Their base was a field near the Southern Front, supporting Soviet forces fighting German advances toward the Caucasus. Living conditions were primitive. The women lived in tents. They had one uniform each, hand-me-down men's uniforms that didn't fit. Boots were too large, stuffed with newspaper. Food was canned rations. Water was rationed. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees during the day and dropped to 50 degrees at night, and they flew every night. Understanding what the 588th accomplished requires understanding the broader context of night harassment bombing. The concept was simple. Prevent enemy forces from sleeping, resting, or operating effectively at night by conducting continuous bombing raids. Each individual raid caused minimal physical damage. 2 220-pound bombs couldn't destroy major targets. But the psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned to fear nighttime. The sound of Po-2 engines became associated with death. Sleep deprivation became chronic. Morale collapsed. The German military took the night witches seriously enough to offer automatic Iron Cross decorations to any pilot who shot down a Po-2. This was unprecedented. The Iron Cross was typically awarded for extraordinary valor, not for shooting down one specific type of aircraft. The fact that Germany offered it automatically for night witch kills indicated how much the 588th was affecting operations. German anti-aircraft crews received special training on engaging slow-moving targets. Fighter squadrons were assigned specifically to hunt Po-2s at night. Searchlight batteries were positioned to defend critical targets. The entire German defensive apparatus on the Eastern Front adapted to counter one all-female regiment flying obsolete biplanes. The 588th's tactics evolved continuously. Initially, aircraft flew individually to targets, dropped bombs, and returned. But German defenses adapted. Searchlights would catch single aircraft and flak would destroy them. By July 1942, the regiment had developed coordinated tactics. 3 aircraft would approach a target together. 2 decoy aircraft would deliberately attract searchlight attention, flying in circles to keep the lights focused on them. Meanwhile, the 3rd attack aircraft would glide in from a different direction in darkness and hit the primary target. After bomb release, all 3 aircraft would scatter in different directions, making tracking impossible. This tactic, called searchlight suppression, reduced casualties significantly. Another innovation was the ultra-low altitude attack. Standard doctrine called for bombing from 1,500 to 2,000 feet altitude, where anti-aircraft fire was less accurate. But the 588th discovered that attacking from 500, 800 feet, barely above treetop level, was actually safer. At such low altitudes, anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress far enough to engage effectively. Searchlights were useless because the aircraft was below their minimum angle. The risk was hitting trees or terrain during the low-level approach. but skilled pilots could navigate by moonlight and visual landmarks. Popova became expert at low-level attacks, sometimes releasing bombs at 400 feet altitude, so low that bomb fragments from her own explosions would strike her aircraft. Popova flew her first combat mission on June 12, 1942. The target was a German supply convoy crossing the Donets River. She and her navigator, Katya Ryabova, took off at 10:30 p.m., climbed to 3,000 feet, and approached the target. At 2 miles out, Popova cut the engine. The Po-2 glided silently toward the target. At 1,000 feet, Ryabova released both bombs. Both missed, landing 50 meters from the convoy, but they'd completed their first mission. They flew 2 more missions that night. The learning curve was steep. By their 10th mission, Popova and Ryabova were hitting targets consistently. By their 20th mission, they were flying low-level attacks. By their 30th mission, they were conducting searchlight suppression for other crews. By the end of June, Popova had flown 18 missions. By the end of July, 45 missions. The operational tempo was relentless. The 588th flew every night that weather permitted. Each crew flew 3 to 8 missions per night depending on target distance and aircraft availability. Popova's record was 18 missions in a single night, a 10-hour marathon where she and Ryabova took off, flew to target, dropped bombs, landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again. 18 times. The physical and mental exhaustion was extreme. After the 18th mission, Popova collapsed from exhaustion and slept for 14 hours. The psychological toll was also severe. Popova watched friends die regularly. On July 28, 1942, her friend Lyudmila Gubina's aircraft was caught by searchlights and destroyed by flak. Gubina and her navigator burned to death. Popova heard their screams over the speaking tube before the radio cut out. On August 3rd, another friend, Yevgenia Rudneva, crash-landed after being hit. Rudneva survived but was badly injured. On August 6th, Tamara Pamyatnik was shot down and killed. Popova attended 3 funerals in 2 weeks. Each time, she wondered when her turn would come. German anti-aircraft defenses adapted quickly. By August 1942, every major German position was defended by searchlights and flak guns. The standard defensive arrangement was concentric circles. Outermost ring had searchlights to acquire targets. Middle ring had 37mm flak guns for high-altitude fire. Inner ring had 20mm automatic cannons for close-range defense. When a Po-2 approached, searchlights would activate and sweep the sky. Once a target was acquired, lights would hand off the target to adjacent lights, creating a cage of illumination that the aircraft couldn't escape. Then flak guns would open fire. The 37mm shells had proximity fuses. They'd explode when passing near an aircraft, creating shrapnel clouds. The 20mm cannons fired tracer rounds. Every 5th round was a tracer containing pyrotechnic material that created visible streaks. When those tracers hit wooden aircraft covered in flammable fabric, fires started immediately. Casualties increased. The 588th lost 4 crews in the first week of August 1942. Popova witnessed multiple aircraft burning in the sky. Plywood and fabric ignited by tracer rounds, crews dying in the flames. She knew her turn would come. It was just a matter of when. She developed rituals to manage fear. Before every mission, she'd check her aircraft methodically. Fuel, oil, control surfaces, bombs. She'd talk to the aircraft, telling it to fly well and bring her home. She'd touch a small photograph she carried of her brother, killed by Germans in 1941. Then she'd climb in, start the engine, and fly. The rituals helped maintain focus. Fear was always present, but ritualized preparation made it manageable. August 14, 1942, was Popova's 73rd combat mission. The target was a German ammunition depot near Mozdok in the North Caucasus. Intelligence reported the depot contained artillery shells and fuel. Destroying it would disrupt German offensive operations in the region. 3 Po-2s were assigned to the mission, Popova and Ryabova in the lead aircraft, followed by 2 more crews. They took off at 10:50 p.m. The flight to target took 22 minutes. As they approached Mozdok, searchlights activated. 6 brilliant white beams swept the sky, searching for aircraft. Popova maintained altitude at 3,000 feet, staying above the searchlight coverage initially. At 11:15 p.m., she cut her engine and began the glide. At 2,800 feet, a searchlight caught them. The Po-2 was illuminated against the night sky. Within seconds, anti-aircraft fire erupted. 37mm flak guns fired continuously, creating orange explosions in the sky. 20mm automatic cannons added streams of tracer fire. Every 5th round was a tracer, creating visible lines of bullets. Popova held the glide. At 2,000 feet, she could see the ammunition depot, wooden buildings and stacks of crates. At 1,500 feet, Ryabova prepared to release the bombs. Then the first tracer struck. It punched through the upper wing, creating a hole the size of a fist. Then another, and another. At 1,200 feet, one tracer struck the fuel tank. Popova felt fuel spray across her face. The smell was overwhelming. She glanced back. Ryabova was also soaked in fuel. Any spark would ignite them both. At 1,000 feet, Ryabova released both bombs. Popova couldn't see where they landed. She was too focused on not dying. She turned hard right, breaking out of the searchlight beam. More tracers followed them. At least 10 more rounds hit the aircraft, tearing through fabric and wood, but none hit the fuel tank again. And critically, none created a spark. Popova climbed to 2,500 feet, escaping the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. That's when she realized the full extent of the damage. The fuel tank was leaking continuously. Fuel vapor filled both cockpits. The aircraft was essentially a flying bomb waiting to explode. She had perhaps 60 seconds before something created a spark and ignited the vapor. Her decision to dive was instantaneous. Not because she'd planned it, but because it was the only option that offered any chance of survival. The dive to 800 feet, the 125mm wind blast, the dispersal of fuel vapor, it worked. But it also used up most of her remaining fuel. The gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining, and the leak was still active, though slower now. Ryabova's voice through the speaking tube. "Can we make it back to base?" Popova calculated. Base was 40 kilometers west, at 85 mph cruising speed. That was 28 minutes flying time. But with fuel leaking, she probably had 15 minutes maximum before the tank was empty. They wouldn't make it. Popova made another decision. "We're landing in Soviet territory. Find me a field." Ryabova pulled out her map, which had multiple bullet holes through it, and tried to identify landmarks by moonlight. "There's an infantry position 3 kilometers west. They should have cleared fields for landing strips." Popova turned west and descended to 1,000 feet. At 11:35 p.m., she spotted fires, Soviet infantry campfires. She circled once, then committed to landing. At 11:38 p.m., the Po-2 touched down in a rough field, bounced twice, and rolled to a stop. The engine coughed and died. The fuel tank was empty. Popova and Ryabova climbed out of the cockpit and collapsed on the ground. Soviet infantry soldiers surrounded them, weapons drawn, then lowered them when they realized the aircraft had Soviet markings. A lieutenant approached. "Are you hurt?" Popova shook her head. "No, but the aircraft is done." The lieutenant examined the Po-2 by flashlight. He counted 14 bullet holes in the wings, 6 in the fuselage, 3 in the tail section. The fuel tank had 2 holes. The fabric covering was torn in multiple places. "You flew this aircraft back after taking all these hits?" Popova nodded. "We didn't have a choice." The infantry regiment provided a truck to transport Popova and Ryabova back to their base, arriving at 2:30 a.m. on August 15th. Major Bershanskaya was waiting. She examined both women, fuel-soaked, exhausted, shaking from adrenaline. "What happened?" Popova explained. The mission, the hits, the fuel leak, the dive. Bershanskaya listened without interrupting. When Popova finished, Bershanskaya said, "You dove straight down at 2,500 feet with fuel spraying into the cockpit?" Popova confirmed. "Yes, ma'am. It was either dive and maybe survive, or stay level and definitely burn." Bershanskaya considered this. "That dive violated every safety regulation. You could have lost control. The aircraft could have broken apart. You could have blacked out from G-forces." Popova agreed. "Yes, ma'am, but we're alive." Bershanskaya smiled slightly. "Yes, you are, and you'll fly again tomorrow night." The damaged Po-2 was recovered 3 days later by maintenance crews. They determined it was repairable but would take a week. In the meantime, Popova was assigned a different aircraft. She flew 15 more missions in August 1942, bringing her total to 88 missions in 3 months. The dive technique she'd used, using windblast to disperse fuel vapor, became known among the night witches as Popova's maneuver. Other pilots attempted it when their aircraft were hit and leaking fuel. Some survived, some didn't. The maneuver required perfect timing, perfect execution, and a little luck. But it was better than no option at all. Popova continued flying throughout the war. By December 1942, she'd flown 200 missions. By June 1943, 400 missions. By January 1944, 600 missions. The stress was immense. She watched friends die. She was shot down multiple times. On August 2, 1942, 12 days before the famous dive, her aircraft had crashed in the Caucasus Mountains after being hit by flak. She and Ryabova had survived and were rescued by Soviet infantry after 3 days in the wilderness. In March 1943, her aircraft was hit by shrapnel from an exploding shell. Ryabova was wounded, metal fragments embedded in her abdomen. Popova, partially unconscious from a concussion, relied on Ryabova's guidance to land safely despite both being injured. They flew together for over 200 missions, an extraordinary partnership built on absolute trust. In late 1943, Popova's life changed dramatically. During a mission where her aircraft was shot down, she joined a retreating Soviet infantry column. Among the wounded soldiers, she met Semyon Kharlamov, a fighter pilot who'd also been shot down. Kharlamov was reading "And Quiet Flows the Dawn" when Popova arrived. They started talking. They discovered they had similar backgrounds, both from working-class families, both motivated by patriotism and revenge after family losses. They fell in love. They married in early 1944 during a brief leave. Their honeymoon lasted 8 hours. Both had missions scheduled. Kharlamov survived the war and eventually became a colonel general in the Soviet Air Force. Popova flew her final combat mission on May 4, 1945, 5 days before Germany surrendered. Her total: 852 combat missions over 3 years. She'd been hit by anti-aircraft fire 42 times. The famous incident where she returned with 42 bullet holes in her aircraft, map, and helmet occurred in late 1944. She'd been shot down twice and forced to crash land 6 times. She'd lost numerous friends and fellow pilots. She'd seen horrors that would have broken most people. But she kept flying because the mission mattered more than fear. Post-war, Popova worked as a flight instructor for nearly 2 decades. She trained hundreds of civilian pilots, passing on her skills and experience. She and Kharlamov had a son, Alexander, who graduated from the Air Force Academy and became a pilot himself. Kharlamov died in 1990. Popova lived another 23 years. She spent those years ensuring the night witches weren't forgotten. She gave countless interviews, wrote memoirs, contacted historians, appeared in documentaries. She wanted the world to know what the 508th had accomplished. But preserving that history wasn't easy. After the war ended in May 1945, the Soviet military disbanded the all-female aviation regiments. The official position was that women had served heroically during the emergency, but would return to traditional roles during peacetime. The night witches were thanked for their service and told to go home. Many faced discrimination when seeking employment. Employers were reluctant to hire women who'd flown combat missions. They were considered too aggressive, too independent, unwilling to accept traditional gender roles. Several Night Witch veterans applied for civilian pilot positions and were rejected explicitly because they were women. Soviet historians initially paid little attention to the Night Witches. Historical accounts of World War II focused on male heroes, tank battles, infantry charges, fighter aces. When women were mentioned, it was typically as nurses or support personnel. The Night Witches' combat achievements didn't fit post-war Soviet narratives about traditional femininity and motherhood. By the 1960s, most Soviet citizens under age 40 had never heard of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The women who'd terrorized German forces for 3 years had been forgotten. Popova refused to let that happen. In the 1970s and 1980s, she began actively campaigning to preserve Night Witch history. She contacted Soviet newspapers and television stations, requesting coverage. Most ignored her. She wrote letters to the Ministry of Defense, requesting official recognition. The letters went unanswered. She organized reunions of surviving Night Witches. By 1980, only about 40 were still alive. They'd meet annually, share memories, and support each other. But public recognition remained elusive. The breakthrough came in the late 1980s during Glasnost, when Soviet media began covering previously suppressed topics. In 1988, Soviet television produced a documentary about the Night Witches titled The Women Who Defied Death. Popova was featured prominently. The documentary was broadcast nationally and reached millions of viewers. Suddenly, people were learning about the 588th for the first time. Newspapers ran follow-up articles. Books were commissioned. The Night Witches re-entered Soviet consciousness. Western historians discovered the Night Witches around the same time. In 1981, British historian Bruce Miles published Night Witches, The Untold Story of Soviet Women in Combat, the first major English-language work about the regiment. The book was based partially on interviews with Popova and other veterans. It was translated into multiple languages and introduced the Night Witches to international audiences. Suddenly, Popova was receiving interview requests from journalists worldwide. The New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, major newspapers globally were telling her story. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian archives opened to researchers. Historians gained access to operational records, mission reports, and casualty lists that had been classified for 50 years. This documentation confirmed everything the veterans had been saying. The 588th had indeed flown 23,843 combat sorties. They had indeed dropped 3,000 tons of bombs. They had indeed achieved results that seemed impossible for obsolete aircraft flown by women whom society said couldn't fight. The numbers were accurate. The stories were true. Popova became the Night Witch's primary spokesperson. She gave hundreds of interviews between 1988 and 2013. She appeared in documentaries, wrote memoirs, spoke at schools and universities. She was invited to military academies to lecture on tactics and leadership. She attended ceremonies honoring fallen Night Witches. She worked with museums to preserve artifacts, uniforms, photographs, logbooks, medals. She wanted physical evidence preserved so future generations could see what the 588th had accomplished. One particular interview in 2011 revealed her motivations. A journalist asked, "Why do you work so hard to preserve this history? The war ended 66 years ago. Why does it still matter?" Popova's response: "It matters because my friends died. 32 women from my regiment were killed. They died fighting for their country, fighting for freedom, fighting because they refused to surrender. If I don't tell their stories, who will? If I don't preserve their memory, they'll be forgotten. I owe them this." I survived. They didn't. The least I can do is make sure their sacrifice meant something. On July 8, 2013, Nadezhda Popova died at age 91 in Moscow. Her obituary appeared in every major newspaper worldwide. The New York Times obituary ran 200 words, extraordinary for someone who wasn't a head of state or celebrity. The Telegraph called her one of the most celebrated pilots of World War II. Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a statement praising her service. The Russian Air Force sent representatives to her funeral. Surviving night witches attended. By 2013, only about a dozen were still alive. They eulogized Popova as a friend, a hero, and a woman who never stopped fighting. Her son Alexander, speaking at the funeral, said, "My mother flew 852 combat missions. She was shot down, forced to crash land, hit by flak 42 times. But the mission she considered most important wasn't during the war. It was after the war, ensuring that her sisters were remembered. She spent 68 years preserving their stories. That was her final mission, and she accomplished it." In 2013, 2 months after Popova's death, the Russian government established a memorial to the night witches at their former base near Engels. The memorial includes a restored Po-2 aircraft, bronze statues of pilots and navigators, and plaques listing all 32 women killed in action. Each plaque includes the woman's name, age, and number of missions flown. Visiting the memorial, reading those names and ages: Yevgenia Rudneva, age 24, 645 missions; Olga Sanfirova, age 22, 630 missions; Lyudmila Gubina, age 20, 107 missions, makes the cost visceral. These weren't statistics. They were young women who died fighting. The technique Popova invented that night, diving to disperse fuel vapor, has been studied by modern aviation safety experts. In theory, it shouldn't work. A steep dive increases the risk of structural failure, loss of control, and G-force-induced unconsciousness. But Popova's dive wasn't theoretical. It was practical, desperate, and successful. Modern flight simulators have attempted to recreate the scenario. Results are mixed. Some pilots successfully dispersed the vapor. Others lost control during pullout. The consensus: the maneuver requires exceptional skill, perfect conditions, and luck. Popova had all three that night. That's the story of Nadezhda Popova and August 14, 1942, when her aircraft was hit, fuel sprayed into the cockpit, and she made a split-second decision to dive straight down at 125 mph to blow out the fuel vapor before it ignited. That's the story of a 20-year-old woman flying a wooden biplane who invented a survival technique that violated every rule of aviation safety, and it worked. That's the story of 852 missions, 42 hits, multiple crash landings, and a life dedicated to ensuring her sisters in arms were never forgotten. If stories like this remind you that impossible decisions sometimes save lives, that courage means acting despite fear, and that the greatest heroes often come from the most unlikely places, hit that like button. Subscribe for more Night Witches stories and other unlikely warriors who changed history. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what you'd have done in Popova's position. We read every comment. These women deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.